Jonathan Smith, a religious and historical scholar, says that to understand religions, we must study them in terms of history and humanity. Although Afrofuturism is not confined to just religious mediums, it shares many elements: origin stories, dystopian futures, mythology, philosophy, and the capacity to produce social and political change, just to name a few. To understand and discuss Afrofuturism in a meaningful way, it is necessary to look at the history and the experiences of the men and women behind the movement. The history of the Atlantic slave trade is well known to us all. However, we've heard this story and we experience its effects through our Western perspectives. It's important to understand what actually happened in Africa and how the slave trade would impact the inhabitants, their descendants, the economy, history, and the future. In his TED Talk, The Atlantic Slave Trade, What Too Few Textbooks Told You, Anthony Hazard gives some insight into what happened in and to Africa. When slave trade began, the individuals who first entered the system were criminals, debtors, and prisoners of war from other tribes. They were not seen as fellow Africans. However, as the institution of slavery grew, the demand for slaves did as well. The tribes who took part in the practice grew vastly rich, enabling them to have control within Africa. Those who did not were at serious risk of becoming enslaved themselves or being destroyed. Thus, it became a matter of survival for African tribes to take part in the Atlantic slave trade. Slavery was no longer a result of war, but a reason for it. Effectively, it was an arms race. When Europe and the Americas finally outlawed slave trade, the African economies who had depended upon it collapsed. Realms were open to conquest and colonization. Africa had been devastated twice. More than 10 million able-bodied Africans were forcibly removed by way of the Atlantic slave trade. This was more than the loss of a physical place, or even family and freedom. The scale was so large, and so many were removed and separated. This was the loss of centuries of accumulated knowledge, culture, and the stories passed on to them by their elders. Our stories define us. Theirs have been destroyed, their histories altered by the supremacists who wrote the books for centuries. The past is gone. Africa will never be the same and seems impossible to reach. Even if return was possible, there no longer is a home or a tribe to return to, and the future for the continent of Africa looks hopeless. In an article in Art Education in 2020, Joni Boyd Acuff offers a perspective of the current racial situation in America. Daily, we can turn on the television and watch horrific violence being committed on black women, transgenders, and unarmed men. Acuff says that as a black woman in the United States, it has become nearly impossible to imagine what the future holds for all black Americans. Reprieve from these futureless visions, she says, has only come during engagements with the arts, specifically art created by black artists who create art that presents a future in which black Americans are healed from racial, social, and economic violence and are living healthy lives, flourishing, and united through African diasporic ideals. Without their roots, but bearing generations of trauma, a dismal present, and a future that seems both doomed and completely beyond their control, imagining a future beyond this space and time, where technology has been reclaimed and used to advance and heal the entire race, has emerged. This idea of a future with a healed black race is seen in countless forms: art, music, books, philosophy, and even political organizations. This idea is a cornerstone of Afrofuturism. Wikipedia defines Afrofuturism as a cultural aesthetic, philosophy of science, and philosophy of history that explores the developing intersection of African diaspora culture with technology. Mark Derry first coined the term Afrofuturism in 1994 in an article called Black to the Future. He defines Afrofuturism, for want of a better term, as speculative fiction that treat African American themes and addresses African American concerns in the context of 20th century technoculture, and more generally, African American signification that appropriates images of technology and a prosthetically enhanced future. He also talks about how, in a sense, African Americans are living in a sci-fi nightmare, descendants of alien abductees facing impossible forces, their histories undone, and technology widely used to oppress, harm, and enslave them. He also raises an important question that is at the heart of Afrofuturism. Can a community whose past has been deliberately rubbed out and whose energies have been subsequently consumed by the search for legible traces of its history imagine possible futures? In her TED Talk, Stories That Imagine a Future Africa, Nigerian-American sci-fi writer Nnedi Okorafor reaffirms the speculative nature of science fiction. She says much of the genre speculates about technologies, societies, social issues, what's beyond our planet, what's within our planet. It's all about the question, what if? Nnedi is a prolific writer, and she authored Wakanda Forever. Growing up, though, she didn't read much science fiction. This is because she couldn't really see herself in these stories. To illuminate the differences between classical and Afrofuturistic science fiction, Nnedi offers an analogy. Like humans, octopuses are some of the most intelligent creatures on Earth. However, octopus intelligence evolved from a different evolutionary line, separate from that of human beings, so the foundation is different. The same can be said about the foundations of various forms of science fiction. When you do not see yourself represented in a field of art or study, it's difficult to relate to it. There's a sense of power in creating your own space and story. Avant-garde jazz musician Sun Ra is thought of as one of the earliest producers of Afrofuturism in music. He had some incredibly wild ideas, and many dismissed his views because they felt that focus should be on the real world and change should be enacted here and now. Behind his theology, however, we see three major elements that are key to understanding Afrofuturism. First, Sun Ra claims that the black race has no hope of a future in which they will be free to live in natural harmony. Second, they must create their own identity and society far from this time and space. Third, this will be accomplished by means of advanced technology. Sun Ra's music and theology still influences artists to this day. Afrofuturism and the appropriation of technology once used to oppress the entire race, however, is not always packaged in subjective, intangible, fictitious form. The Black Panther Party provides an excellent example, as Daniel Kreese illustrates in his article, Appropriating the Master's Tools, Sun Ra, the Black Panthers, and Black Consciousness, 1952 to 1973. He states that the practices of the Black Panther Party served as a symbolic presentation of their revolutionary consciousness and were oriented toward both the liberation of the individual black psyche and changing the individual's consciousness of being part of an oppressed group. Their stylistic and uniform outfits, afros, berets, marches, police patrols, and guns could be perceived as threatening. They were undoubtedly presented as such by the media. They were a threat, but not so much because of their capacity to inflict harm. In fact, they were doing nothing more than practicing their constitutional right to bear arms for self-defense, although it should be noted that some leaders did advocate for violent revolution. The real threat was in what these symbols could and did do for the collective Black psyche. The guns were merely artifacts, and they held a power largely and historically unknown to Black Americans. The Black Panther Party sparked real, long-lasting political and social change. Marvel Studios' 2018 film The Black Panther is an excellent example of Afrofuturism. The movie gives the viewer much to speculate on. How would the world be different if Africa held the most valuable resources and technology on Earth, and rather than being pillaged by colonists, it had kept it for itself to flourish? Wakanda is a fictional third world country in the Marvel universe. It's one of the poorest nations in the world, or at least that's what they have the world and the United Nations convinced of. In fact, Wakanda is wealthy and technologically advanced beyond what anyone from the outside world could even possibly imagine. Built on top of and powered by vibranium, the strongest element in the known universe, Wakanda has spent centuries perfecting their technology, and they have created their own utopia. In an article in Film Criticism from 2019, Anthony Faramelli elaborates on the story's premise further. He says the mythology of Wakanda is that of a constant and uninterrupted line of development. However, this came at a great human cost. Wakanda could have used its advanced technology to defend Africa from colonial invaders, but that would have exposed it to the world and opened it up to the risk of exploitation. Wakanda chose to hide from the world in order to protect its own citizens, and it achieved its utopian dream by sacrificing all other Africans. The Black Panther film presents a new origin story, and a radically altered present and future are created. It is an entirely different reality, wherein the balance of power and resources has been tipped to the other side. It imagines an Africa decolonized. The effects this film has already had on the collective consciousness is impossible to measure. It's also exposed the notion of Afrofuturism on a global scale. Western scholars first viewed Afrofuturism as a uniquely American movement. However, globalization is happening at a rate unmatched in human history. Moreover, space and time are no longer confinements. The use of audio and video recording, social media, and other online platforms allow individuals across the world to communicate, learn, and share ideas and experiences. Reynaldo Anderson talks about Afrofuturism 2.0 and the new developments that are emerging. He says that Afrofuturism 2.0 is the beginning of both a move away and an answer to the Eurocentric perspective of the 20th century's early formulation of Afrofuturism that wondered if the history of African peoples, especially in North America, had been deliberately erased. Simply put, he says, future-looking Black scholars, artists, and activists are not only reclaiming their right to tell their own stories, but also to critique the European American digerati class of their narratives about cultural others, past, present, and future, and challenging their presumed authority to be the sole interpreters of Black lives and Black futures. What the future may hold for Afrofuturism and the political and social changes it can birth are unknown. What it has the power to do for the individual is undeniable. The opportunity to imagine and create your own story, past, present, and future, beyond the space, time, and oppression of the world you know.